The pills? I flushed them the night my daughter-in-law hid my birth certificate. Margaret, the mother, never raised her voice, but her son Daniel's hand trembled holding the eviction notice with her name on it. The house she bought after her husband died? No longer theirs. Brooke, the daughter-in-law who called her senile, had been cheating. They tried to erase her memory, rewrite her worth, but Margaret remembered everything. And this time, she held the pen. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. They said I forgot the stove. I remember the look in their eyes when they said it. The pan had barely scorched. A whisper of smoke, a faint sizzle from the butter. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her fingers curled around the handle, the eggs still uncracked in her other hand. And yet, Daniel's face was all furrowed brows and carefully concealed fear. "Mom," he said softly, like a teacher addressing a child, "you left it on again. You could have hurt yourself." Margaret blinked at him, then turned the knob off slowly, deliberately. She didn't argue. She didn't say she'd only stepped into the pantry for less than a minute. What she remembered wasn't the stove. It was the subtle flicker of relief in Brooke's eyes behind Daniel. Relief that they had something to use. That was the first time they handed her the bottle. A matte white plastic container, labeled in soft greens and blues, Neurovive, memory and focus support. A daily supplement, they called it. "Just a little helper," Brooke had chirped, pressing it into Margaret's hand with a smile too wide to be sincere. "We all take vitamins. No shame in a little help." The pills were chalky and sour beneath her tongue. Soon, small things began to change. Cabinets began locking at night. The knives moved to a high shelf. The gas valve was fitted with a timer. Brooke rearranged the refrigerator, labels facing front, Post-its marking what Margaret could and couldn't eat. Daniel installed a nanny cam in the living room under the excuse of feeling safer if we're out. It wasn't safety, it was surveillance. At first, Margaret told herself it was love, poorly executed, overprotection, worry. But love doesn't ask you to sit in silence while your son whispers in the next room, "She's slipping, Brooke. I think we'll need to have that conversation soon." "She's not slipping," Brooke replied. "She's circling. That's worse." Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe. She simply stared out the window, one hand curled around her mug of tea. Now cold. Chamomile, because caffeine made her jittery, according to Brooke. The taste had started to feel like surrender. But Margaret Bennett didn't break. She observed. And one afternoon, while Brooke was out and Daniel was on a call, Margaret went upstairs. Not to her room. Hers was now the former craft room, hastily made into a cozy nook. No, she went to theirs. The master bedroom smelled like lavender and fabric softener. Margaret moved quietly, opening drawers, sliding aside old photo albums and receipts. And under the bed, tucked in a manila folder with insurance files, she found it. Brooke's journal. It wasn't leather-bound or poetic. It was cheap. Lined pages, pink cover, a sticker of a smiling avocado on the front. Inside, neat handwriting detailed incidents. Feb 12, left kettle on again. Claimed she didn't remember. March 3rd, tried to feed the cat twice, confused. March 11th, asked where Dan was. He'd been gone for 5 minutes. Lies. Fabricated moments, twisted retellings. None of it true. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her breath shallow. So this was their plan. A trail of concerns written in Brooke's hand. Proof, should they ever need to petition for guardianship. A soft push toward erasing her independence under the guise of concern. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't rage. She walked back to her room, the one with a lamp too dim and curtains that didn't quite close, and knelt by her bottom drawer. Inside, under an old cashmere shawl, was her own journal. Black leather, crisp white pages. Her hand trembled only slightly as she opened it. Her pen met paper. Entry number 48. They think I don't notice the locks. The pills, the condescension, but I've been taking notes longer than they've been lying. Outside her window, the wind rustled the leaves with a whisper like warning. The house groaned faintly as the heater clicked on. Brooke's voice echoed faintly from downstairs. Margaret closed the journal, tucked it back into place. Then, calmly, she took out her phone and began typing a name she hadn't spoken in years, Janet M. Granger, her old colleague, a woman who once said, "If they ever come for your mind, make sure you own the receipts." And Margaret? She had them. As her tea reheats in the microwave, Margaret opens a fresh journal page, titles it Phase 2 Begins, and presses send on the message, "Janet, I think it's time." They called it a guest room, but I was the ghost they wanted to forget. The door creaked open with that slow, guilty groan only an old hinge could make. Cold air hit Margaret's ankles like a warning. The basement lights flickered once, then steadied, yellow, washed out, unforgiving. "This way, Mom," Daniel said, forcing cheer into his voice. "It's just for safety, you know? Fewer stairs, more manageable." Margaret stood at the top of the basement stairs, arms folded. From where she stood, she could still see the upstairs den, the one with her late husband's favorite armchair, now occupied by Brooke's endless throw pillows. She didn't move. Daniel gestured again. "I just think with everything going on, it might be good to settle in somewhere a little quieter. We can make it cozy." Cozy. A word people used for cages with better lighting. Margaret descended the steps in silence. Her slippers didn't make a sound on the thin carpet. The room smelled faintly of paint thinner and cardboard, remnants of the storage this space had been before. A cot with a thin floral blanket had been placed near the wall. A makeshift nightstand, an overturned packing box, sat beside it with a dusty lamp and a pill organizer. No photos, no windows, no dignity. "I'll bring your things down later," Daniel said, just while Brooke's reorganizing the upstairs rooms. "She needs her office now that she's remote." Remote. Margaret bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Brooke sold overpriced crystal water bottles on Instagram. Her office was a ring light and a tripod. When Daniel left, Margaret sat on the edge of the cot, the springs squeaking beneath her weight. Her fingers ran along the uneven texture of the blanket. Her eyes drifted toward the low ceiling beams. This house. This very house. They wouldn't even have it if she hadn't drained every piece of her past to build it. Flashback 2004. The pawnshop clerk held her ruby wedding necklace up to the light. "Beautiful piece? Sentimental?" he asked. Margaret nodded once, unable to speak. That necklace was the last gift her husband gave her before the accident. "That'll fetch enough to cover about a semester," he added, ringing it up. And she did it. Quietly. To keep Daniel in college, to keep him afloat, to keep him dreaming. Now he was lowering her into the basement like she was something fragile to store. Upstairs, a laugh burst through the vents. Brooke's voice, sharp and too loud on speakerphone, carried straight down. "I mean, honestly, she still wears that same cardigan from, what? The early 2000s? It's like living with a thrift store mannequin." The friend on the other end cackled. Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she stood. Her body might have softened with age, but her movements were still deliberate, graceful, controlled. She walked up the stairs, not to confront, not yet. She had something better in mind. In their bedroom? Yes, their bedroom. She moved past the noise in the kitchen and slipped inside. Daniel's shoes were by the dresser. Brooke's perfume bottles lined the vanity like trophies. She crouched by the bed, fingers pressing along the bottom frame. And there it was. A red accordion file, zipped halfway, the edge of a label peeking out. She pulled it free and read the typed sticker. Power of attorney, prepared draft. No date, no signatures, but everything else. Printed, itemized, legal. Pages of her medical details, bills in her name, documents that suggested incompetence and mental decline. Not a discussion. A plan. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change, but something inside her, not rage, not fear, something colder, settled like a storm cloud waiting for its cue. She zipped the folder back and slid it back into place. Downstairs, the basement light was still on. She walked back toward the glow, passing Brooke's voice, mid-joke. As Margaret re-enters the guest room, she pulls a small voice recorder from her pocket, one Daniel gifted her last Christmas, and places it beneath the cot. This time, the ghost is listening. They thought I forgot my past. But I never forget survival. The morning fog hung low in the park like a secret waiting to be told. Sparrows fluttered in bursts across the dew-wet grass. Margaret sat on her usual bench, plaid scarf tucked around her neck, hands folded over her purse. She didn't look like a woman plotting anything. But every breath she took was laced with memory. A jogger passed, a dog barked. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter carried like it used to when Daniel was 5 and believed she could fix anything. She used to believe that too. "Is this seat taken?" a familiar voice asked. Margaret turned, lips twitching into the ghost of a smile. "It is now." Janet Reynolds sat down, her trench coat still damp from the morning mist. She smelled like eucalyptus and black coffee. "You look good," Janet said, pulling out a thermos and pouring them both a cup. "But your eyes, they look like they've been reading people instead of books." Margaret gave a short laugh, dry, restrained. "That's the thing about pretending to be forgetful. You see everything because no one expects you to be watching." They sipped in silence. Then, slowly, Margaret unfolded the edges of her story. The basement guest room, the pills, the fake concern in Daniel's eyes. She didn't say it all, just enough. Janet, sharp as ever, didn't need the whole picture. "You know, I'm still organizing estates for the firm. We could use someone with your memory, assuming, of course, you haven't actually misplaced it." "Not even a corner," Margaret said. Janet grinned. "Want to help me sort through some digital files? Nothing complicated, just old accounts, reconciliations. I know you kept your certification active." Margaret looked at the ducks gliding across the lake and nodded. "I'd like that." Back home, the walls of the basement didn't feel quite as close. Maybe it was the air from the park still clinging to her sleeves. Or maybe it was what she now carried inside her, a flicker of her old self reigniting. She opened the drawer Daniel rarely touched. Inside, tucked between expired coupons and a broken keychain, was her old phone, charger still coiled like a snake. She plugged it in. The screen flickered. Updates rolled in. Passwords typed themselves from memory her family thought was gone. A few clicks led her to a banking app, one she used to use when managing their finances before Daniel got too busy to care. She typed in her maiden name, tried a few combinations of old credentials. Access granted. A list of accounts populated the screen. Most were closed, archived. But then, account ending in 7734, joint, M. Thorne, D. Thorne. Balance, 87,219.46. Margaret stared, not blinking, not breathing. She hadn't touched this account in over a decade. It was from the days when she'd worked as a caregiver for 3 elderly clients, juggling shifts while Daniel was in graduate school. She used to deposit part of her income there so he'd have access, just in case. Apparently, he never closed it. The kicker? The most recent deposit was 2 years ago, from a tax refund she had never seen. Her hands didn't shake. Instead, she reached for a notepad and wrote down every detail. The routing number, the date the account was last accessed, every cent accounted for. She leaned back on the cot, heart steady. They thought she forgot the stove. They forgot she used to handle 6-figure accounts and balance them to the penny. Outside her door, she heard Brooke's laughter. But it was distant now, like static in another room. Margaret smiled to herself. As she closes the app, her finger hovers above a single button. Transfer funds. But instead of pressing it, she whispers, "Let's see what you do next, Daniel." They never checked the one account I controlled. The thrill wasn't in the money. It was in the fact that they hadn't noticed. Not a single alert. Not a question. Margaret had siphoned nearly 20 grand from the old joint account into a private one, quiet as breath, clean as rain. The silence that followed? That was its own kind of victory, because people only monitor what they think is theirs, and Daniel, her son, hadn't looked at that account in years. Margaret stood by the front door with a small package in her hand. Brown craft paper, white label, no sender name. Just her name, Margaret Thorne, typed neatly in block font. She hadn't seen her full name on anything in months. She carried the box to the basement and closed the door behind her. The musty air greeted her like an old friend. She sat on the edge of her cot and unwrapped the box like it was sacred. Inside, a leather-bound copy of Pride and Prejudice, an exact match of the edition her late husband once gave her on their second anniversary, the same navy cover, the same gold trim, a book Daniel once spilled juice on and never replaced. She smiled, let the weight of it rest on her lap. The next day, another parcel arrived, lavender-scented soap, then a silk scarf in olive green. After that, a bottle of perfume she hadn't worn in 15 years. Each item she sent to herself using her maiden name, each purchase made from her private account, her taste, her past, her own. Brooke wasn't pleased. "I don't know what's going on with her lately," she muttered one afternoon on the phone, pacing in the kitchen just above Margaret's room. "She's ordering random things she won't even remember. There's a scarf in the mail, a damn scarf, in July." Margaret sat below, smiling, her teacup still and full. "She's probably seen some ad on Facebook," Brooke added, "or she thinks it's her birthday." There were no birthdays coming, and no ads Margaret cared to see. That night, while the house was asleep, Margaret padded upstairs in her slippers. She moved like a shadow, barely creaking the floorboards. In her robe pocket was a new purchase, one not sent through the mail. A mini spy camera, no bigger than a walnut, disguised inside a plug-in, nightlight. She placed it in the kitchen socket behind the fruit bowl. The lens pointed directly toward the medicine cabinet. For 2 days, she did nothing. She watched Brooke act sweet and frazzled, saw her serve Margaret tea with the same relaxation drops she always insisted on. Margaret sipped nothing. Then, on the 3rd day, while Daniel was at work and Brooke thought the house was empty, Margaret accessed the camera feed from her laptop. The footage began with Brooke bustling around the kitchen, talking to herself, cleaning nothing. Then, she paused, looked around, and opened the cabinet. From the back, Brooke pulled out a small, amber pill bottle. Margaret squinted. It wasn't hers. Brooke unscrewed the cap, dumped 2 pills into her hand, and walked over to the teacup that sat by the kettle. She crushed the pills on a small plate with the back of a spoon, stirred the powder into the tea, smiled. Then she poured in milk. Margaret's milk. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't even blink. Her breath stayed steady, heart calm as stone. She leaned closer to the screen, paused it right as Brooke's smirk flickered across the lens. Caught. That night, Margaret served Brooke a cup of untouched tea. She placed it gently on the table beside her. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about writing things down, just in case." Brooke blinked. "What kind of things?" Margaret smiled. "Just little details. I find memory returns when it's written in ink." Brooke picked up the tea and sniffed it. Didn't drink. Margaret watched. Back in her room, Margaret rewinds the footage one more time. This time she zooms in on the label of the bottle Brooke hid. It wasn't just any pills. It was her actual prescription. And Brooke had moved it. Margaret whispers, "Now I know exactly what you're afraid I'll remember. They called me confused. That day I was crystal clear." Margaret was never losing her memory. She was testing theirs. The teacup trembled in Margaret's hand. Not because of age, but calculation. She knew what was in it. She knew who put it there. And today, for once, she wasn't going to pretend. Not to sip, not to forget. Because they thought her silence was confusion. They never imagined it was strategy. The morning began with a lie disguised as kindness. "Sleep okay, Margaret?" Brooke asked, her voice syrupy, eyes scanning for signs of weakness. She handed over a tray with tea, toast, and 2 supplements placed carefully beside the cup. Margaret blinked slowly, then smiled. "You're always so thoughtful, dear." She didn't touch the pills. Downstairs, she opened her laptop and watched the footage again, frame by frame. Brooke's hands, the substitution. Then, with calm precision, Margaret clicked delete all. Not because she needed the footage anymore, because she was done playing defense. She opened the locked drawer in her wardrobe and pulled out the accordion folder she'd hidden for weeks. In it, scanned copies of every document Brooke and Daniel had tried to keep from her. One file stood out, the power of attorney papers. Her signature stared back at her. Except she never signed that paper. And the woman who did had forgotten Margaret once worked in fraud detection. Later that afternoon, she waited in the living room with a cup of plain water. The soft tick of the grandfather clock matched her heartbeat, steady, deliberate. Brooke walked in wearing workout clothes, fake cheer pasted on. "Hey," she chirped, "just checking. Did you take your morning meds?" Margaret smiled. "I thought about it." Brooke tilted her head. "You forgot again, didn't you?" Margaret took a sip of water. "That's what you're hoping for, isn't it?" There was a flicker, a crack in the porcelain facade. "Excuse me? You'd like it better if I didn't remember much. Easier to manage. Easier to, redirect my funds." Brooke's lips tightened. "That's not fair, Margaret. We've been taking care of you. We're worried." "I know," Margaret said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "And I think you're the one who should be worried now." Margaret stood and walked to the cabinet where they kept the mail. She reached into the back and pulled out another folder. Inside, receipts, emails, notes she'd written and dated. She dropped it on the table like a gavel. "Tell Daniel I found everything," she said, "and tell him I remember every sacrifice, especially the ones he's forgotten." Flashback, 1986. Margaret stands in line at a pawn shop, her wedding ring clutched in her hand. Daniel, age 10, waits outside in his school uniform. She smiles through tears as the clerk takes the ring and counts out the cash. Tuition was due. His dreams mattered. Her pride could wait. Now the same boy, now a man, was letting his wife poison the hand that once fed him. Margaret sat back down, folding her hands calmly. "I'll be gone for a few hours," she said softly. "Just a walk." Brooke, stunned, nodded automatically. "Sure." Margaret paused at the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Brooke," she said, almost kindly, "you should throw out those pills. They won't work on me anymore." The air outside was brisk, biting. It felt like a rebirth. Every inhale was layered with cold and freedom. Her shoes crunched the gravel as she walked 2 blocks to the library, where she used the public Wi-Fi. She opened her email, typed one name, Vanessa Harris. They hadn't spoken in years. But back when Margaret was a financial officer, Vanessa was a junior associate, sharp, loyal, eager. Now she was a partner at one of the biggest elder law firms in the state. Margaret tapped the mic on her phone and recorded a voice message. "Vanessa, it's Margaret Thorne. I think it's time we caught up. I have a story I need to tell, off the record, and a signature I need reviewed." She hit send. A reply came within minutes. "Margaret, I've been waiting for this day. Let's talk now." Margaret leaned back on the library bench, wind tugging at her scarf. For the first time in months, she didn't feel old. She felt ready. They cried for me in public, then laughed behind doors. The applause was for her casserole, but not for her. Margaret stood in the kitchen's archway like wallpaper, unnoticed yet surrounded. They toasted to family. But no one looked her in the eyes, because to them she was no longer family. She was furniture with a heartbeat. Brooke's voice rang from the dining room, laced with charm so sweet it could rot enamel. "She's still mostly with it, thank God, but lately she's been forgetting little things. You know, signs." A woman gasped, wine glass halfway to her lips. "Oh no! Early dementia?" Brooke nodded solemnly, squeezing Daniel's arm for added effect. "We're just trying to be patient." Margaret stood 3 feet away, holding a pitcher. Not one head turned toward her. She poured mechanically into glasses. Water, red wine, more water, more silence. The only seat left was a high stool in the corner, with no place setting. Daniel caught her eye across the room and mouthed, "You okay?" She nodded, slowly, and smiled, just the way they liked it, harmless and soft. Later, as laughter filled the air, Margaret quietly moved between conversations. "Oh, Brooke's birthday?" she whispered to the guest beside her. "Daniel almost forgot last year. I had to text him from the pharmacy." The woman chuckled, not thinking twice. At the opposite end, she leaned near a couple from Brooke's yoga class. "Did you hear about that fight in the parking lot last month? Between Brooke and that man with the tattoos?" Laughter again. None of it loud enough to seem malicious, but just loud enough to seed doubt. She was becoming useful noise. In the hallway, Brooke cornered Daniel, voice low but sharp. "She's saying weird things again. I think it's time we had a real conversation about what comes next." Daniel exhaled hard. "Come on, she's fine, just old." Margaret passed them, trailing the scent of rosemary and detergent. She said nothing, but she caught Daniel's gaze, held it, just long enough to unsettle him. That night, long after the guests had gone and the wine stains were wiped clean, Margaret sat alone in her basement room. She flipped through a notebook lined with columns. Each entry had a date, a name, a quote, a result. She wasn't just playing along. She was compiling a timeline. Suddenly, the doorbell rang upstairs. She heard Brooke's footsteps, heard the door open, then silence. A few minutes later, Brooke came down with a padded envelope and dropped it on Margaret's nightstand without a word. The flap was already torn slightly. Someone had peeked. Margaret waited until Brooke left, then slowly unsealed it. Inside, a letter from the county clerk, a gold-embossed certificate. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the document. Legal property owner, Margaret Eleanor Thorne. Parcel ID, reinstated by petition. She let out a slow breath. The house was hers again. Taped to the bottom of the envelope was a sticky note, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. "They can't sell what they don't own. V." Margaret narrowed her eyes. She reached for her phone and opened her saved contacts. There it was. Vanessa. The lawyer. The salt stung her tongue, but she swallowed it with a smile. Across the table, Brooke gagged. Daniel winced. Margaret simply reached for her teacup. Every sip she took, she imagined the day she'd toast alone, in a house that was hers again. The roast was dry on purpose. The green beans were undercooked. The mashed potatoes, a mountain of salt disguised as comfort. Margaret plated it all with grace, her movements slow, precise, almost reverent. "Dinner's ready," she called out, setting the final plate with deliberate clang on the table. Daniel and Brooke entered mid-argument, quiet, strained. "She's trying," Daniel muttered, eyeing Brooke. "I didn't say she wasn't," Brooke whispered back through gritted teeth. Margaret didn't need to hear their words to understand the tension. It sat between them like a third course. She poured tea. The steam curled toward her glasses, fogging them faintly. "Chamomile helps settle the nerves," she said, not looking at anyone in particular. They began to eat. The clink of cutlery against porcelain sounded louder than the soft jazz Brooke had playing from her Bluetooth speaker. The silence grew long, heavy. Brooke was the first to break. "Did you put the whole salt shaker in these potatoes?" Margaret blinked slowly. "Oh dear. I must have. I suppose I forgot." Brooke pushed her plate back with theatrical disgust. "Seriously?" Daniel, embarrassed, glanced between them. "It's fine, Brooke. It's not that bad." "Not that bad?" "My tongue is burning." "It was an accident," he said, but his voice didn't carry much conviction. Margaret dabbed her lips with her napkin. "I do apologize. My memory's been such a concern lately." She looked directly at Brooke then. The way a knife glints before it cuts. The meal disintegrated from there. Brooke barely touched her food. Daniel tried to keep peace by forcing small talk about weather, about traffic, about a news article Margaret had clearly read weeks ago before he'd even found it. The fracture Margaret had hoped to see had begun. She sipped her tea again, eyes trailing the cracks already forming between them. A careless comment here, a snapped reply there. Every little tension was a future earthquake, and she had just triggered the first tremor. Later that night, Margaret retreated to her room, her basement suite, as Brooke mockingly called it, and pulled out the manila envelope she'd prepared days ago. Inside, a fresh copy of the deed, signed, stamped, sealed. She slid it into a padded mailer, addressed it to a P.O. box she'd opened under her maiden name. The walk to the mailbox felt lighter than any she'd taken in months. The cool night breeze bit gently at her face, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was still very much alive. She lifted the box's red flag, let the envelope slide in, and whispered to herself, "First move played." The next day was uneventful in the loudest way. Brooke didn't speak. Daniel avoided eye contact. Margaret smiled more than usual, humming softly as she arranged flowers in the entryway. Daisies, white and unassuming. Like her. That afternoon, with time to herself, she decided to indulge in her favorite pastime, watching people reveal themselves. She parked near the downtown hotel Daniel had once mentioned in passing. Something about a spa package he bought Brooke. She wasn't stalking. She was confirming a theory. And there it was. At 4:22 p.m., a car pulled in. Brooke stepped out, dressed not like a woman running errands, but like a woman meeting someone. He appeared from the side entrance, tall, trim, confident. Margaret stayed silent, clutching her steering wheel as Brooke greeted the man with a kiss on the cheek that lingered. They laughed, too closely, walked inside. Margaret didn't reach for her phone, didn't take a picture. She didn't need evidence, not yet. She just needed confirmation, and now she had it. She rolled up the window and whispered into the silence, "Let's see how much you forget when I start remembering everything." He didn't see me cry, or maybe he chose not to. Either way, I watched him sip his coffee and smile like the world was still whole, while mine had been shattered by his hands, and I realized, some sons love their mothers only when it's convenient. Margaret picked the cafe carefully, quiet, tucked away, with windows that spilled sunlight across the hardwood floors like golden confessions. She arrived early, choosing a corner booth where no one would rush them. She wore a soft blue cardigan, and the perfume Daniel once said reminded him of bedtime stories. He was 13 minutes late. "Hey, Mom," he said, sliding into the booth without eye contact, already glancing at the menu. "Sorry. Traffic." She smiled gently. "Of course." The server arrived, cheerful and young. Margaret ordered tea. Daniel asked for an oat milk latte and an avocado toast, like he was auditioning for a lifestyle vlog. "Everything okay at home?" she asked softly, fingers wrapping around her warm ceramic mug. Daniel sighed. "Brooke's been stressed. You know how weddings at work can be. She's got 3 this weekend." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She let the silence sit, thick and humming between them. "I wanted to talk about something," she said finally. "About getting older. I've been thinking a lot lately about dignity." Daniel blinked. "Is this about the basement again?" Margaret chuckled dryly. "No, dear. This is about me. About what it feels like to be seen as a burden. To be erased, slowly, kindly, like a smudge on glass." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "You're not a burden, Mom. Then why does it feel like I'm only allowed to exist in the corners of the house I paid for?" That silenced him. The food arrived. Daniel busied himself with cutting his toast. Margaret watched the way his fingers trembled slightly. Guilt or caffeine, she wasn't sure. She reached for her purse, pretending to look for something, and caught a glimpse of his phone lighting up on the table. "Brooke, needs Sephora total. Going to grab that serum and jacket." Without thinking, Daniel picked it up, tapped quickly, and opened his mobile banking app. Margaret's eyes flickered toward the screen. He scrolled down and selected Margaret's pension-linked card. In real time, she watched him pay for a $364 online order. Not even a blink of hesitation. The breath caught in her throat like a tiny thread pulled too tight. "You were saying something about dignity?" he said, glancing up, smiling as if they were still playing mother and son. Margaret returned the smile. "Just that it matters. Even when people think you don't notice. How little of it you're given." Daniel nodded, clearly not listening. "You know we care about you, right?" Margaret stared into his eyes. "I used to believe that," she said. "Now I believe something else." Later that night, in her room beneath the creaky floors they called her safe space, she opened her tablet and pulled up her online banking. With each tap, she peeled back a layer of their entitlement. New PIN, set. Automatic transfers, disabled. Card status, frozen. She clicked confirm and leaned back, exhaling. A text came through seconds later. Daniel. "Daniel. Hey, your card's not working. Did the bank flag it?" Margaret stared at the message. She didn't respond. Instead, she whispered into the stillness, They never saw me crying, but they'll remember the day I stopped paying for their silence. Across town, Daniel stood at a checkout counter, cheeks flushed, eyes darting. His card had just been declined. Twice. The cashier stared, waiting. Daniel forced a laugh and muttered, "That's weird. It always works." But it didn't. Not anymore. And somewhere, sipping tea in silence, Margaret finally felt seen, even if only by herself. They tracked my steps. But they didn't know I watched too. The footage didn't lie. But the people in her life did. Beautifully, often with concern sweetened like poison. Now it was her turn to watch. Not just remember, not just suspect. Watch. And Margaret had made sure the eye that saw her now saw them too. Clearly. Coldly. Quietly. The camera, barely the size of a thimble, sat nestled behind the china teapot on the shelf, just above the hallway that led to her bedroom. It wasn't high-tech, just high enough to catch what they thought would never be seen. Margaret clicked play again. There, in shaky nighttime light, was Brooke, barefoot, brayless, hair pinned up in a rushed, careless knot. She moved like a thief who didn't believe in locks. The bedroom door creaked open. Brooke slipped inside, her phone flashlight illuminating the dresser drawers. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Margaret leaned closer to the screen, heart thumping in slow, deep beats. On the footage, Brooke lifted a manila folder from beneath Margaret's wool scarves. She flipped it open, skimmed, and, without so much as a second glance, ripped the pages in half. Again. Again. Until the fragments fluttered to the floor like falling leaves. Medical files, neatly kept records. Gone. The next morning, Margaret moved slowly through the kitchen, pouring herself tea as Brooke clattered dishes in the sink with fake cheer. "You sleep all right, Mags?" Brooke asked, her back turned. Margaret stirred her tea with a calm hand. "Like a rock," she replied softly. Brooke didn't look back. Didn't need to. She had already erased the paper trail. Or so she thought. Margaret waited until Brooke left for work, her designer tote swinging like a threat at her side. Then she pulled out her laptop and slipped the micro SD card from the camera. She uploaded the clip, trimmed it, and renamed the file, June 14th, Private Property Invasion. No caption, no dramatic accusation, just footage. She attached it to an anonymous email addressed to hr@summitfertilityclinic.com. Subject line, "Elder Abuse by Brooke Jensen. Confidential evidence attached." She hit send. Then she closed the laptop and whispered to herself, "Now, let's see who gets to decide reality." 2 days passed. Margaret said nothing. Brooke was quieter than usual. Less flair, more nerves. She didn't hover in the kitchen. Didn't ask how Margaret was feeling. She was waiting for something. Then came the explosion. Late Friday afternoon, the front door slammed hard enough to rattle the coat hooks. Daniel's voice barked across the hall. "What do you mean they've put you on leave?" Margaret, perched in the living room with her knitting, didn't flinch. "I didn't do anything," Brooke hissed. "Someone sent a fake video. It's edited, manipulated." "Did you go through her stuff, Brooke?" A pause. "Too long." Brooke's voice cracked. "I was looking for the grocery list." Margaret clicked. Her needles together once. Deliberate. Echoing. "Funny place to keep cereal brands, don't you think?" Silence answered her. Daniel stormed up the stairs. Brooke didn't follow. That night, Margaret heard the vibration of Daniel's phone buzzing from the kitchen counter as he washed his hands. She glanced at the caller ID, Child and Family Services. She watched his face pale as he answered. "Yes, this is Daniel Jensen. Yes, she's here. My mother... No, she's not alone. She..." "What? Tomorrow? A welfare check?" His eyes darted toward Margaret, who stood in the hallway. Calm, slippers soft against the hardwood. He mouthed something, but she had already turned away. The next morning at 9:13 a.m., a knock echoed through the house. 2 social workers stood at the door with clipboards and concerned eyes. Margaret stepped forward before Daniel could speak. "Come in," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "I've been expecting you." It wasn't the meal that turned cold. It was the marriage. The table was set for peace, but the knives weren't just for carving roast. Brooke had lit every candle, plated every dish, but nothing could smother the scent of strategy. Margaret could smell it the moment she walked in. Tonight wasn't about family. It was a final audition for control. And Margaret had memorized the script Brooke didn't know she wrote. The roast chicken glistened under a perfect golden skin, steam curling into the chandelier light like a ghost on cue, mashed potatoes fluffed into clouds, wine breathed in decanters. Everything smelled like comfort, but felt like a trap. Margaret moved slowly, careful with each step, her cardigan slightly unbuttoned to play the part, disheveled but gentle. Brooke greeted her with 2 wide eyes and a rehearsed smile. "You look lovely tonight, Margaret. We wanted to treat you." "We always sounds nicer when it's mostly you," Margaret replied, then sat. Daniel cleared his throat and tried to butter a roll as if the tension wasn't crawling up the walls. Brooke poured wine. "To moving forward," she said. Margaret raised her glass but didn't sip. "Forward to where?" There was a flicker in Brooke's smile, barely a crack, but Margaret caught it like glass underfoot. Dinner began with small talk. Brooke steered the conversation with forced enthusiasm. Weather, errands, how quiet the house had been. Margaret let her fork clink just loud enough to interrupt. "Do they allow visitors at assisted living facilities on weekends?" Brooke froze mid-sentence. Daniel blinked. "What?" Margaret looked at her plate. "I saw a brochure. It had my name scribbled on the corner. You left it in the kitchen drawer?" Brooke fumbled. "That was just research. In case, you ever needed to be removed quietly," Margaret asked, slicing her chicken. "To help with your brand partnerships, maybe? Can't have the senile mother-in-law in the background while you live stream skincare routines?" Brooke shot Daniel a sharp glance. "You told her?" "I didn't know," Daniel mumbled, eyes darting. Margaret took her time chewing. The silence that followed was louder than anything said. Brooke slammed her wine down. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. She's paranoid. She's turning everything into a conspiracy." Margaret smiled sweetly. "I forget a lot, Brooke, but legal language? That sticks." She reached into her pocket and laid a folded piece of paper on the table, slowly slid it toward Daniel. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned, his jaw dropped. "Brooke," he said softly, "this is a transfer application. It names me as power of attorney." Brooke paled. It was just in case. You said we needed options." "You forged her signature," Daniel whispered. Brooke stood suddenly. "No, I didn't." Margaret took her wine glass finally, raised it toward Brooke, and whispered, "To clarity." Brooke stared, then knocked her chair back and stormed from the room, her footsteps thunder on the stairs. Daniel remained frozen, still staring at the document like it might change its wording if he blinked hard enough. Margaret reached into her cardigan once more and placed a second item on the table, an assisted living brochure, this time with her own handwritten note across the top. "Your plan. My backup." They sat in silence. The candles flickered. The roast cooled. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, whispering reminders of winter. Daniel looked up slowly. "Mom, You didn't want to know," Margaret said. "But you knew. Deep down." He looked away. She stood, cleared her plate, and walked to the sink. No more words. Not tonight. The next morning, the guest room was empty. Daniel's side of the bed untouched. Brooke checked the driveway. Daniel's car was gone. And this time, he wasn't answering his phone. "They wanted me out. Instead, I packed them up." The thud of cardboard hitting the hardwood echoed like a final verdict. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't curse. She simply labeled each box like she had once. Labeled Daniel's lunch for school. Only this time it wasn't ham or turkey inside. It was betrayal, tied with tape. And the expiration date had finally arrived. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating dust motes and movement, men in uniforms carefully carrying out lives that no longer belonged here. Furniture, throw pillows, and a gaudy gold-framed print that Brooke insisted made the room classy, all being wrapped and wheeled out. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter with a mug of tea, its steam rising like peace after a war. She didn't supervise. She didn't need to. Every mover had been briefed, every document signed. The deed had her name, only her name, once again, in ink that Brooke could never scrub off. Brooke came downstairs mid-chaos, barefoot and breathless, her silk robe barely tied. "What is happening?" Margaret didn't look up. "Packing. You'll want to be gone by next week." Brooke laughed, a high-pitched, nervous thing that didn't reach her eyes. "That's funny. You're delusional if you think—" Margaret finally turned. Calm, steady, the weight of decades behind her words. "No. What's delusional is thinking you could erase me in my own home." Brooke's voice rose. "Daniel will never let you get away with this. He already did." Margaret stepped to the counter, slid a thick envelope toward her. Court-approved transfer of title, rescission of power of attorney, and an official cease and desist on any financial access. Oh, and a police report, sealed but active, on medical interference. "Should I keep going?" Brooke's face blanched. "You're bluffing." Margaret simply sipped her tea. One of the movers wheeled past with a box labeled Brooke, Closet, Shoes. Another followed, hauling a marble-top vanity Brooke had once bragged about finding on sale, only $3,000. "You think you're so clever?" Brooke spat, her voice cracking. "What kind of mother does this?" Margaret paused, eyes steady. The kind who finally remembered she's not just someone's mother. Brooke blinked. "The kind who learned silence doesn't mean submission," Margaret added, softer now. "And that kindness doesn't mean weakness." There was no shouting. No more threats. Just footsteps. Brooke stomping back up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. But even that felt hollow. Outside, a for sale sign waited in the garage, its legs still wrapped in bubble wrap. Margaret had planned everything down to the hour. By 4 p.m., the last box had been wheeled out. Margaret handed the movers a crisp tip, thanked them for their discretion, and stood in the quiet of a half-empty house that suddenly felt larger than it ever had. Just after dusk, headlights curled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out, briefcase in hand, tie loosened. He paused, froze. Where Brooke's SUV had once parked, there was nothing. The garage was cracked open, but the lights inside were dark. His eyes shifted left, to the white sign hammered into the lawn. "For sale, by owner." And underneath, in elegant serif font, Margaret A. Whitmore, sole trustee. Daniel's jaw clenched. He dropped his keys. He didn't even make it to the door. From the upstairs window, Margaret watched her son take in the scene. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, the same way he once did when she begged to stay. The house smelled like freedom for the first time. The scent hit her first. Not lavender, not lemon polish. Freedom, sharp and clean like rain after fire. For the first time in years, the hallway air didn't carry tension. No one watching, no one whispering. Margaret stepped across the threshold of her bedroom, barefoot and unafraid. It wasn't just a room anymore, it was a reclamation. The door creaked softly as she opened it, and for a moment she hesitated. This room, once hers, had been stripped of her. Neutral walls, a cold white bedspread, the vague trace of Brooke's perfume clinging to the curtains. But Margaret wasn't here to cry over the past. She was here to replace it. She pulled the drapes wide open. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood, stretching like arms welcoming her home. She took in the quiet, the way it echoed back wholeness. Her steps were measured, reverent, like walking through a church built from memory. The first thing she did was open the cedar chest in the corner. Inside, dozens of old photo albums lay stacked. Margaret sat cross-legged on the floor, slowly flipping through them. Her husband's face smiled back from a wedding photo, young and stubborn and soft. Daniel, gap-toothed at 5, reaching for cake. Christmases, graduations, backyard birthdays. But for every image that warmed her chest, another pierced it. She paused on a photo of Daniel with his college diploma, her arms around him, pride in her eyes, and exhaustion. She burned that one, not out of hate, out of truth. The fire crackled gently in the fireplace as she fed it selective memories, photos where she was cropped out, forgotten in the frame, made invisible. Pages of Brooke's passive-aggressive holiday cards followed, but others, ones that made her remember who she was, not who they made her feel like, those she framed, hung beside the window, placed on her nightstand. By afternoon, the bedroom had begun to look like her again. A woven quilt from her sister draped over the chair, a lavender sachet in the drawer, a single white rose in a mason jar. Simple, quiet joy. She opened the windows. A breeze swept through, cool and forgiving. Then the doorbell rang. It was Diane from next door, clutching a casserole dish and wearing disbelief like mascara. "I heard," she said, eyes wide. "Is it true? They're gone?" Margaret just smiled. The house finally remembered who paid for it. Soon, more neighbors appeared. An older couple from across the street offered to help repaint the mailbox. Another brought muffins. One woman hugged her without asking, too tight, too long, but full of relief. It was strange. These people hadn't spoken up when Brooke ruled the porch like a queen, but now? They nodded, they stayed, they asked what she needed. Margaret didn't need anything, she just needed them to see her standing. That night, she soaked in a lavender bath, toes wrinkling, heart unfolding. She slipped into a soft cotton robe, her own, not borrowed, and settled in her bed with tea and silence. Her phone buzzed, a voice note from Brooke. Margaret didn't press play immediately, but curiosity won. Brooke's voice was low, sharp. "I hope you rot in that house. You'll die alone in those old sheets with nothing but your damn memories. Enjoy your freedom. It's the only thing you've got left." Margaret blinked once, then deleted it. She didn't reply. She didn't need to, because silence was louder than war when it came from a woman who'd finally remembered her worth. She placed her phone on the nightstand and turned to set the alarm. Ping, a new notification, a friend request. She froze. The name on the screen made her breath catch. Mitchell Baines, her ex, Daniel's father, the man who left before Daniel learned how to walk. The same man she had seen in a blurry security photo slipping into a hotel beside Brooke. Margaret stared at the screen. Her finger hovered over accept, but in her chest, something colder stirred. Because ghosts only return when they think you've forgotten how to fight. They made me feel invisible. Now the whole world's watching. The man Brooke was meeting is Daniel's biological father, Margaret's ex who abandoned them. The moment he walked into the cafe, time buckled. Same eyes, same crooked grin, and the same cowardice hiding beneath charm. He sat down like he'd never disappeared. Margaret didn't blink, didn't breathe, just pressed record under the table, and smiled. The cafe was quiet except for the soft clatter of ceramic cups and the hum of a Sinatra tune floating overhead. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, watching the man across from her with the detachment of a scientist observing a virus under glass. Mitchell Baines looked older, but not wiser. The years had added weight to his face and streaks of gray to his temples, but his eyes, Daniel's eyes, were still quick, darting, calculating. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, adjusting his leather jacket like it still meant something. "I came to listen, not to forgive," Margaret replied evenly, her tone butter-smooth and ice-cold. He offered a sad smile. "That's fair." The silence sat heavy between them. Outside the window, a mother passed with a stroller, her head bent in soft conversation with a baby who hadn't yet learned betrayal. Mitchell finally spoke. "She contacted me a few months ago. Brooke said you were slipping, that maybe Daniel needed someone stable, someone from his real family to step in." Margaret raised a brow. "Real family?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Mitchell sighed, running a hand over his mouth. "I know how that sounds. I wasn't a good man. I left when Daniel was just a baby. I thought I was doing you a favor back then. I wasn't ready to be anything." Margaret tilted her head. "And now?" He leaned in, whispering like a confession mattered now. "Now I want to fix things. Maybe it's too late for us, but I want to be there. For Daniel." Margaret laughed, low and bitter. You want to be there for the son you never raised because the woman manipulating him invited you to? She said you were going to ruin him, he added. That you were sick? Margaret cut in sharply. Mitchell faltered. Not in so many words. She placed her cup down. The click was louder than it should have been. She told you I was losing my memory. Yes. Margaret met his eyes full on. And you believed her. Mitchell looked away. She smiled again. The kind of smile forged in war, not peace. Tell me something. Does she kiss you the way I used to? Or does she kiss like she's trying to rewrite her past through someone else's history? His mouth opened, then shut. Margaret stood slowly, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small black envelope and placed it gently on the table between them. This conversation has been recorded. Every word, every admission. You came here because she sent you, not because you missed your son. Mitchell's face drained of color. If you ever try to reach out again, publicly or privately, this will go to Daniel and to the internet. She walked out without another word, the cafe door chiming behind her like punctuation. Later that evening, Daniel showed up at her door, red-eyed and shaking. You talked to my father? He demanded. Margaret didn't answer right away. She handed him an envelope. Inside were photos, Brooke and Mitchell entering the hotel, printouts of texts Brooke had sent under an alias, bank withdrawals from Daniel's shared account being funneled to Mitchell. Daniel stared. Why would she? She wanted control, Margaret said quietly, and she knew how to find someone who'd sell his son's name for a second chance. He dropped onto the porch step, face in his hands. You recorded him? I recorded survival. A long silence stretched. Only the chirp of crickets dared fill it. Daniel looked up, tearful. What am I supposed to do with this? Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, but her voice stayed steel. Decide if you want to be a son to the woman who raised you, or a man who repeats his father's mistakes. Every broken piece built my freedom. He didn't slam the door when he left, didn't shout, didn't cry, just carried his last box like it was filled with regret. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, barefoot, watching her only son descend into silence. No goodbyes, no apologies, only the echo of steps that no longer belonged in her home. Daniel's car pulled away without so much as a glance in the rearview mirror. The driveway, once a place where birthday balloons floated, where chalk drawings covered the concrete, was now just empty space. Margaret exhaled, long and slow, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold hours ago. For a moment, the stillness threatened to swallow her. Then she smiled. The very next morning, she stripped the guest room first. Brooke's old domain. The walls were still a cold, calculated beige, the bedding crisp but impersonal. Margaret opened the closet, pulled out every forgotten designer heel, every perfume bottle left like territory markers, and packed them into donation bags. With each folded blouse, each plastic hanger dropped into the box, she felt lighter. Then she walked into her own bedroom. This time she didn't tidy it, she claimed it. She painted the walls a pale green, the same shade her late husband once called hopeful. She hung sheer white curtains that fluttered gently with the spring breeze, framed a photo of herself as a young woman, standing in front of a college lecture hall, notebooks in hand, before marriage, before sacrifice, before motherhood swallowed her whole. She didn't erase the past. She rearranged it. In the evenings, Margaret would sit on the floor of her living room, sorting through old photo albums and letters. Some photos she framed and placed on her freshly painted mantel, ones where she was laughing, where she looked proud. Others, ones filled with hollow smiles and forced gatherings, she burned in the fireplace one by one. The flame crackled with soft satisfaction. Her hands smelled like lavender from the cleaning gloves. The citrusy tang of fresh paint still hung in the air. Freedom, it turned out, had a scent. One afternoon, she walked into the local art store and enrolled in a 6-week painting class. Something abstract, she told the clerk, who beamed and handed her a student discount coupon. She joined a book club at the library, mostly women her age, but none who knew what she had just survived. That was the best part. She could start over as just Margaret. Not Daniel's mom, not the lady who got scammed. Just herself. But the story wouldn't stay buried. After giving a short talk at a senior center about elder rights, just a small speech, nothing flashy, a woman from the back of the room approached her. "You have a way of making survival sound like strength," she said, clutching a notepad with trembling hands. "Would you ever go public with it?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. The woman handed her a business card. A glossy, bold font podcast title glared back at her, "Voices We Erased." "It's national," the woman continued. "Real stories, unfiltered. You'd help a lot of people." Margaret looked down at the card. The corners were sharp, fresh, just like her. She didn't answer right away, just slipped the card into her bag. That night, as she watered the new jasmine in her garden, her phone buzzed. A subject line lit up. "Podcast interview. Confirmation. You're scheduled." Margaret blinked, confused. She hadn't replied. Then another message came in, from Janet. "I knew you'd say yes, so I said it for you. They thought I was losing memories, but I became one they'll never forget." The microphone was small, but what she said into it echoed louder than anything they ever said about her. And as Margaret sat beneath the old dogwood tree, sunlight painting her garden gold, she realized something no one had ever told her in all these years. Survival wasn't the end. It was the introduction. The jasmine bloomed early that morning. Margaret knelt in the soil with her gloves half on, the smell of earth rich and grounding. A robin chirped somewhere on the fence. The wind carried the scent of rosemary from her herb patch, and the warmth of late spring draped over her shoulders like a shawl she no longer needed to clutch for protection. Her phone buzzed beside the watering can. The podcast had gone live an hour ago. "This week's guest is Margaret Albright," the host's voice said, polished and curious. She was labeled forgetful, fragile, a burden. But this is the truth behind the silence. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just kept pruning, because what she'd lived through, what she'd built back from, didn't feel like something you mourn. It felt like something you honored. By noon, her inbox was flooded. Messages from women in their 50s, 60s, even a few in their 20s, all saying the same thing. "Thank you. Your story gave me the courage to leave my son's house. I thought I was the only one they were trying to erase. I remembered everything too. I just didn't know I was allowed to say it out loud." Margaret sat at her desk, one hand resting on the edge of her laptop, the other tracing the rim of her teacup. And then, an alert. A message from Daniel. Just one line. "I'm sorry. I didn't see it then." She stared at the words longer than she meant to. They looked sincere, but she'd learned the hard way that sincerity and guilt could wear the same mask. "Still," she replied, "you were loved. That was enough." She didn't hit send with anger. She didn't hit it with pity. She hit it with peace. That afternoon, she opened the hall closet, the very back shelf where the broken things used to hide, and there it was, the mop Brooke once shoved into her hands with a smirk and a whisper, "Make yourself useful." Margaret took it out slowly, like retrieving a relic. Its wooden handle worn, the threads faded with time and bleach. It wasn't just a cleaning tool, it was the moment she knew they'd stopped seeing her as a person. Just a shadow in their house, just a mistake they inherited. She clipped a small brass plaque onto a velvet backing, "Fuel," then placed the mop into a custom-built shadow box, mounted it on the wall near the front door. Not hidden, featured, a symbol of everything they tried to erase and everything she reclaimed. The final light of day slid through the blinds as Margaret stepped out into the garden one last time that evening. The breeze was cooler now, softer. She sat in her favorite chair, the cushions sagging a little in the middle, like her bones, but still holding. A mug of chamomile warmed her hands. The distant hum of a lawnmower faded. A neighbor's wind chime tinkled like laughter she hadn't heard in years. And in that silence, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt remembered. By herself. "I remembered everything, and that's what saved me.